I've recently been synthesizing a lot of very high level principles and values and things like that, which are sort of deeply religious and spiritual, metaphysical, and all these sorts of things. And so you must forgive my tangential um, sort of parallel points that I make, which are obviously quite esoteric and usually quite separable from some kind of political things, but metaphorically or at least thematically they pertain, or at least for people that are interested in the other subjects, it's an interesting cross correlation to point out and such because. I mean, people in libertarian political circles have known this for a long time. There's always been somewhat of an underground, deep tradition of a kind of truth seeking or esoteric, philosophical, metaphysical, sort of some idea. Because, this is what libertarianism does, is it gives the individual the freedom, the latitude to explore, to investigate, and then they use that latitude to do something productive with it. And some people use that for creativity, some people use that for other things, but some people do it for trying to answer hard questions that seemingly are that pertain to religious profundity or etc etc. That's somewhat the fruit of the libertarian political structure, to some degree at least. One of them. um, there are also perhaps also tangible ones, but just sort of the work of trying to maintain a liberal political order is itself a feat that contends quite deeply with the human condition. Um, and that leads me to my point about redressing the topic of the American legal system. Now, I have, in my public submission that I made on hate speech, when I made my own version of a hate speech bill, and I also um, introduced it in a separate piece of paper, sort of just critiquing the current form of the hate speech legislation, but also talking about some general issues of jurisprudence and law itself. And in it, I critiqued the American legal system, and I've been thinking about it more. And I can imagine in my head playing devil's advocate against my own the things that I laid out. The things that I laid out are perfectly fine, but they don't show all their workings out. They don't show a full, sort of QED um, demonstration of uh, uh, the claims that I make. So I'm going to tackle the American what is wrong with the American legal system or justice system, constitutional framework from my perspective. Now, I have perhaps been too broad in my critique. I mean, I not substantively, but in how I present this. So I'm going to hopefully now give a much more balanced critique of the American system. So what's wrong with the American system is that it's not a bad political system. It's just a very bad system to have a republic. Like, and I see this is slightly confusing. I have to is that how the republic is structured is fundamentally it doesn't have integrity. Now that was a political feature which made it's part of the genius of the American system that it doesn't work. Its values are not they don't in as much as the American Constitution guarantees liberty, or in as much as it guarantees anything, which quite sadly it doesn't really guarantee anything, that's just really propaganda. That's democratic propaganda to try and create the soft cultural framework in the democracy to lead towards the preservation of the republic. But the republic is purely at the mercy of the dominion of the democracy. The American legal system is very, I would argue, morally equivalent to the Roman law itself. In some sense, the democracy is the emperor, and the democracy is given dominion. So the democracy can choose to remove all the amendments of the constitution or section them out, essentially, to section them into oblivion. So and by so doing also keep the record of its sectioning out of these things, because it's, yeah, you are the emperor, the democracy is the emperor. So now this is a useful de facto political, because in some sense the democracy, in as much as a democracy is attached to a republic at all, the republic will only be preserved at the good grace, or at the democratic endorsement at some point. I mean, obviously democracies as large social political, sort of creatures or whatever, and the you can argue that the American political system certainly has its merit. And my critique of America is not, I mean, it doesn't really, it becomes a political critique because the justice system is so fundamentally amoral, is the fundamental problem that I have with the American system, is that justice and law in America cannot be called the rule of law. It is quintessentially the rule of man. It is quintessentially in the hands of the democracy, and there's nothing stopping the democracy. And in some sense, all the constitutional amendments are lines in the sand waiting to be sectioned out. Now, people can argue that I'm making a finicky technical point there, um, because as long as the things are there in some form, even though they're only there for now or until they've been sectioned out, they're still in practice and they still are part of this living experiment or something like that. Now, let me tell you the weakness to that. The weakness to that is that you don't get a full set of conceptual principles and values. You get a ragtag experimental hodgepodge of the democracy trying to live up to creating substantive mechanisms, but these substantive mechanisms are never retained by the republic. They're always at the pleasure and the mercy of the democracy. And in some sense, this whole experimental framework means is that the judge, at the end of the day, the American judge that is in a court case, they do not use reason. They have to come up with maybe some procedural things and some things that they call rationality and things like that, but they can't reason that far beyond the ambit of the democratic formulation that they have to work with. There is no high substantive value or principle that hasn't in some sense been politically defined for them by the democracy. The judge, the American judge, is a neutered functionary, and is on a kind of leash, and that leash, or that fundamental denigration of the rule of law itself, or relegation of it into the hands of the democracy, means that there's a disjuncture between the integrity of the citizen, of the individual citizen, does not get to have a full set of substantive values and principles upon which to stand on. They only have the rhetoric. They only have the propaganda that the Constitution really is. The American Constitution is a kind of soft democratic propaganda to keep the flame of liberty burning as an experiment or whatever. And this means that essentially you can't get redress through the courts. You have to get it through the democracy. You have to get it through politics, essentially. You have to fight for your rights in America through politics, which I find to be a disgusting, that's an amoral system, in my view. Now, you could say that, well, in the sense that it's amoral, it's de facto healthy, because in the sense that you then, if you want to guarantee your rights, the judge isn't really going to guarantee your rights. It's your democratic representative that you have to make sure cares about ensuring your rights. Such a politician, such a representative, is the only long-term, medium-term solution to the problem. The only long-term solution via the medium term. So It forces you to engage in the political process if you want to retain your rights. And in some sense, there is a truth to that, because even if you had a perfect system on paper, in theory, it would still be demolished in practice if everyone just ignored it. So you do actually have to have some political fight about it, as it were, because the stricture itself, the actual, a constitution is just a piece of paper if no one is willing to enforce it, that kind of thing. So, in some sense, you could argue that the American political structure and framework is saying, if you care about your republic, you have to keep it. The famous Ben Franklin quote, uh, it's a republic if you can keep it. Now, I've tried to make a counter argument, essentially, to that general claim, because in a political way, it makes perfect sense and it's perfectly correct. And it's perhaps even superior because it tells the culture, tells the society who have this structure ingrained in their framework of how government works. They know to some degree that they have to vote for politicians that have their values. And the problem is that values and substantive principles in law is a very complicated sort of thing. It's very hard to know that certain things that are written down have these far-reaching consequences or effects downstream. Like, law is a very complicated thing if you want to have a coherent system of it. And I would argue there are very few places in the world that actually have a proper experience of trying to have a coherent system of it. The Roman law the substantive Roman law was a better example of this, because the emperor in Rome did not just dictate what the law was. He could make ad hoc decrees and things like that, but in some sense that was not him making the law. That was him, because essentially the emperor owned everyone. The emperor, because he owned the republic, he owned the citizens, which was why he was able to kill people. He could just, he could say, you've displeased me, and he could just order them murdered, and it wasn't a crime because it was his object. It belonged to him. That's what it meant to be a tyrant. And so, anyway, this is the same tyranny that the democracy in America has, and there's no hedge against it, other than the soft cultural propaganda in the Constitution saying care about liberty, care. But the problem is that these things are complicated, and you have to, and they're so complicated that ideally you need a constitution that has a limitations clause, because rights will always be limited, and so you need to have the mechanism of limitation f- open for everyone to understand and see, so that it can be done transparently, and so that people can't tip the scales. They can't play favorites. They can't generate their own favorite rationalization, because they know exactly what criteria they're arguing about, in terms of whether an infringement of a constitutional right is justified or not. So you need a more sophisticated structure than America is capable of having, so the judges can actually stand up for individuals. But American law is not that sophisticated, it's not that robust, it's not that coherent. It's a mishmash of repromulgated good ideas and good intentions, and it's always an experiment. And it's never conceptually or principally systematic, where it all hangs together. Because only when you see, even if you don't have a system that all hangs together, you have to sort of, because sometimes it's not about prescriptions. It's not about saying, well, this government. You see, like the American legal system itself doesn't use enough principles. It uses criteria. It uses all these little legal tests, which are invented by the legislatures themselves. They're invented by politicians, probably also advised by some lawyers and things like that. Maybe sometimes, every now and again, advised by people who say that, yeah, this is what's happening in the courts, and so if we invent this new procedure, or we invent this new criteria and legal test, maybe it'll have this kind of outcome. So everything is done from sort of the top down. And look, I know some states have the common law and things like that, have a more robust common law system, but they still have a common law system that isn't powerful enough to stand up against the legislature, which can only really happen if you have a strong enough state constitution which has itself legal uh, things like state rights, or as in rights granted to individuals by a state, the state granted rights, and then limitations clause, so that people can so that that can be figured out by a coherent reasoning structure, and somewhat say universal criteria can be found. So I'm trying to somewhat here communicate the essence of how the substantive law in my legal system operates, which is that you don't have different legal tests and different criteria. You also have general principles that cover everything. But then obviously in certain contexts, certain principles will might have to sort of combat with one another for preferential treatment, but they kind of all have to be incorporated in a holistic treatment of the thing. And so that can be up for debate. You can, within my legal system, you can develop legal tests which turn out to be bad legal tests, and then you replace them with new ones. But you do so because you've already got principles that tell you that actually this legal test was falling foul of this fundamental principle or this important principle, which could actually be incorporated, and therefore the common law should shift. And so you've got, therefore, principles that are available to people. You've got these universal values and things like that, which are in the system, which are forced into some kind of coherent, systematic fabric and medium, which supports the individual citizen, also against the the majority. The democratic majority then can't just legislate its morality beyond that kind of fully decentralized structure, because principles and values, those are the most decentralized protection and guarantee for liberty that you can possibly have. And this is why, sorry, this is a slight tangent, but I get very annoyed when I hear people complain all the time about the need to decentralize political power. Look, yeah, I mean, obviously, if you decentralize, you can perhaps have a hope of having a more responsive democracy or something like that, um, because essentially, the elected representative is closer to the voter and therefore is sort of uh, forced to. So perhaps I shouldn't overstep my argument here. I mean, obviously, having more devolved political spheres and nodes of power is, I don't know, in as much as it can be a hedge against sort of large scale corruption. I mean, you can also get kind of small scale mediocrity when you devolve as well. So, and often when people are voting um, in local issues, or if those things aren't very clearly, I really, I'm very despondent about local democracy, because essentially usually people will just vote for big parties anyway, and they will vote for local candidates not based on any kind of local issues or any kind of local debate that they've heard, but just loosely based on kind of ideological leanings that are professed, which are usually only relevant on the national scale anyway. So I'm uh, so I do think that sort of the call for localization or something like that is a misplaced look. It's not as if it isn't a it's not as if it isn't a solution to a problem. It is one way of getting a solution to a problem, but I think that if you solve the same problem in another way, it's far more important. And in some sense, people are so used to political structures that don't have the proper tools, that don't have the proper values and principles and integrity in the system for you to get justice on the basis not through democracy but as an individual suing the state or suing a sphere of government. And obviously implementation, obviously, you would still want the right people to be in the executive command that were democratically accountable and responsible, so that they couldn't mess up the implementation. But I do think that at least in the South African case and in many cases, when policy itself is the problem, that policy itself needs to be able to be judicially reviewed and checked against a constitution. And that is where the integrity of the system and would be ensured, is that certain lines could not be crossed in terms of policy that was being implemented. Or at least if policy wanted to do something, it would have to have a certain amount of reasonableness and criteria attached to that, so that it was done in a constitutionally consistent way. So often it's not really about telling people that they can't do a certain kind of policy. It's that if they do want to do that kind of policy, it has to have all these other bells and whistles to make sure that it's like constitutionally consistent. So it's not so much, wouldn't stop you from doing things. It would just how you implement, or sorry, how the policy was designed exactly. Uh, you know, Obviously implementation would be a separate issue, and then you could obviously sue them if they got the policy right and was constitutionally compliant, but then they just implemented something completely different. That would also be cause for a separate court case then. But the proximate problem that we have now that I can see is not that we don't have devolved enough democracy. It's that the integrity of the system itself is just fundamentally fallen and denigrated, because the judges and the courts themselves don't protect the Constitution. The whole framework is being horribly contorted, at least in the South African one. But this ironically, from my position, goes back to the American issue, which is that on some level perhaps it doesn't matter, even if you did have the right things on paper, which South Africa, in my view, does have the right things on paper in terms of our constitution, when the politicians have politically appointed judges that have reinterpreted the constitution radically, and watered it down, and are essentially political stooges. They're political functionaries. Or politically partisan ideology has been read into the jurisprudence of the Constitution, and being the source of moral corruption, which has now led to this endemic sort of state corruption. But so trying to avoid state corruption by more devolution of power, I think, although, look, I'm not saying that that shouldn't be tried or something like that, but I'm just saying that in principle, it's actually the wrong strategy. Or from the Constitution's point of view, there is a stronger remedy here. But obviously, politically and practically, when you are trying to reform a system that has already been corrupted and captured and institutionally corrupted, how do you uninstitutionally corrupt it without political power? Is a kind of paradox, which would lead one towards wanting more devolution of power. I'm just basically saying that in principle, that's not. I believe it's almost a red herring. It's a diversion. And I think that a lot of people that try to make this general argument, oh well, we always just need devolution of power. Devolution of power equals good. I think that is actually a kind of stupidity. I think that is going to lead one into, because it would be better to have a larger system that is prone to corruption, because then at least you can diagnose that corruption and you can work out how to diffuse it, work out how to defeat it, and how to extricate it from the structure of the system, is much more valuable than just devolving that same corrupt system with that same propensity for abuse or for neglect of the individual citizen. I would rather have a system that's more centralized, where the individual is capable of standing up against the centralized system and being able to defeat it when it crosses the lines that it shouldn't be able to cross. It's more important to me in terms of having a proper functioning liberal democratic open society that actually functions properly. So anyway, maybe I didn't make that point that strongly, but I think that that's an important point. Anyway, I think the whole devolution of power thing is a practical solution to a practical problem. But what I would argue is better is that we need a proper principled. We need to bring integrity. We need to diagnose why we don't have integrity in our system, which is a very esoteric sort of ideological thing to talk about. To talk about how the law has become institutionally corrupted and how the Constitution itself has been hobbled and undermined by a very clear strategy that is, on its way to sort of authoritarianism. Okay. So I was talking about America. So yeah, I mean, so basically, put is that because America doesn't define its republic in substantive terms, because it defines it in rather sort of procedural terms that has some nice libertarian propaganda attached to it, and then it kind of puts it all under the dominion of the democracy, it means that when you go to court in America, the judge doesn't have any substantive values and principles, because you can only claim as an American citizen at the end of the day the 14th Amendment is the strongest tool you have. And let me show you why this is not that good. Because the 14th Amendment says that you have equal protection of the law. Well, just having equal protection of the law doesn't help you if you don't have real substantive positive guarantees and duties and positive duties imposed on the state to give you substantive guarantees of values and such. You just have propaganda of life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. But like what is actually there, so it's sort of it's up to someone's rationalization or interpretation. And this is a bit of a delicate ideological claim to make, but essentially, because you can't see it's not easy to illustrate it from the American side, but it's easy to illustrate it from the South African side. For example, in the South African Constitution, one of the equality clauses is that you have the equal protection and benefit of the law. And the reason why benefit works is because there are a lot of rights in the South African Bill of Rights which are substantive, which are very clearly substantive and have lots of values woven into them. And so we can very clearly see when one benefit is going to one person and it's not going to somebody else, that then they do not have equal benefit of the law. And then, yes, there is a limitations clause that says that some people's rights can be infringed. But if you read the limitations clause, it essentially references the equality clause. And it states quite clearly that, our values are non-racialism and a liberal open democracy. So that quite clearly entrenches the equal protection and benefit of the law. So essentially, almost all laws essentially have to be laws of general application, and they at least have to be laws that if they are going to give special benefits to people, there are special provisions basically about affirmative action, which, if you understand the Constitution, you'll understand has to target disadvantage. It can't target proxies. It can't target any kind of superficial feature. It has to specifically target a specific disadvantage. Otherwise, it would very clearly fall foul of equal protection and benefit of the law, and it would fall foul of non-racialism. So, I mean, this, sort of very clear standard, and, has been dropped by some constitutional judges who won't even actually answer the question. They used the worst excuse. They didn't even say that it's justifiable to have this kind of policy. They said there's a governmental prerogative to provide this affirmative action, therefore it belongs to the democracy. It does not belong to the judges to say whether it's constitutional or not. Directly importing the American corruption into the South African jurisprudence. Utterly disgusting. No excuse. They immediately shirked their own constitutional duty as constitutional court judges. And in my view, in so doing, they committed a war crime, or a crime against humanity at the very least. But I mean, but this is it, I would say that we're on the slippery slope to war crimes, because this is very clearly part of the slow march of the kind of black identitarian chauvinism, fascism, which we see, an ever increasing exacerbation thereof, under this kind of boiling liberal open democracy, like the proverbial frog, slow boil. But it comes from this moral institutionalized corruption of the law. Okay, so there are three other points that I need to make here, in contrast to America. So America doesn't have a structured system like this because they won't manacle the democracy, because de facto the democracy is king to them anyway. So the republic only gets to kind of lurk in the shadows, and it only functions to the extent to which the democracy is capable of endorsing it, that the democracy has created legislation in order to live up to the propaganda in the American Constitution about the liberal open pursuit of happiness and all these sorts of other things. So, the onus is really on the democracy to make the Constitution true in America, essentially. And you can't extract it from a judge at the end of the day. The judge essentially knows that when an individual comes before them, they care much more about the intention of the legislature than they do about the individual. And in some sense, they will only help the individual out to the extent to which that the legislature has already, in some sense, suggested that the individual should be armed with some legal remedy or some legal resilience against whatever the infringement that is being claimed by such a plaintiff. Anyway, now this is not supposed to, and okay, so, and the reason why this exists is because essentially the integrity of the republic in America is framed in this political compromise, or in this political framework, where they give de facto rulership to the democracy, where it's the democracy's responsibility to endorse and uphold the liberty in the republic. And if it shirks that duty, then that's a democratic deficit that needs to democratically be lived up to by the people themselves, who are accountable for developing that. So it has to be developed by the legislature. It has to be developed by American politicians, have to invent liberty and propel it and keep it and argue about it. So it's purely a political animal. The South African structure is completely different. We already have a full substantive framework. Government, the parliament that makes policy, that makes legislation, already has to make legislation that works within that substantive framework, which doesn't work when the judges say there's a governmental prerogative, so we can't have a look at this question about whether it's constitutional or not. Utterly disgusting. No excuse for that. That is an outrageous way to import American jurisprudence into where it does not belong. when our system is quite frankly superior to the American system. Although, as I've already stated, we have fallen foul of, let's say, the de facto, uh, what happens when you actually have people in charge who have no integrity and who don't give a damn, and they are themselves sort of blithely just using the rhetoric to slow boil the open liberal democracy. I mean, so in some sense, this is the worst position that a democracy can ever be in, is when its leadership is very clearly cynical and corrupt and will indulge in rhetoric which helps divert democratic accountability. We have a kind of, it has to do with the identity politics and the kind of way that socialism or communism or, sort of radical redistributive ideas have always shirked the responsibility for their own policy and have always externalized the blame, have always scapegoated, their own failings on, oh, well, the man is holding us down, like Venezuela will complain that, oh, well, it wasn't our fault that the oil prices tanked, and so, and the thing implodes. Um, it's never the regime's fault. It's, and when you have that kind of sort of centralized, and now I'm using the word centralized, I don't mean to contradict myself about because you can have a centralized system that has policy that allows for maximum freedom in the individual, and I think that's what we should have. We should not have to devolve ourselves into municipalities and localities in order to preserve the rule of law. And let's say outrageous or egregious infringements or encroaching into people's, sort of private liberal domain, which is what happens when a government essentially becomes so outrageously unbalanced in its budget and in its, sort of inability to do anything or get anything done or deliver anything, that it uses its own weakness as an excuse to ramp up its radical siphoning and control of resources. Sort of, anyway, it's like this weird kind of perverse incentive that its own failure generates the excuse for its own extension and radical enlargement of its power. It's almost the definition of a cancer. Um, and in some sense, that's exactly what it is in moral language as well, because that's what it does, is it uses its own failures to morally grandstand, um, and also to vilify its ideological scapegoat. So it makes it more radical, more mean-spirited, more, malevolent. And anyway. Okay, so did I make all the points that I wanted to make contrasting America to South Africa? So I still think that the South African system is by far superior. We have, in some sense, I hope that if history goes quite badly, that the South African model will still be used, because it wasn't a failing of the model. It was, you could say maybe it was an accident of history to some degree, but essentially that the party that got in power was so able to control the minds of the masses and to ply them with unconstitutional propaganda and to sort of racialize their consciousness. And in some sense, that's also, you could say, an accident of history in terms of, this disgusting identity politics stuff that's been dispensed in the universities and sort of taken over the what are they called? Sort of the journalism classes, and the commentating, sort of radio hosts and things like that. So we had this tremendous PR campaign, public relations and promotion of, what is essentially a proto-fascistic ideology. Very unlucky. If we had just continued in the way of the 90s, where we would be today. Um, anyway, but you can also see the kind of the ideological incentive there was to developing this kind of politics, because it is identity politics is the politics of unaccountable political leadership. It does essentially make democratic literacy impossible, because you can always just divert blame and scapegoat and use the moral generalizations that are woven into the ideology to very conveniently attack the moral character of your ideological opponents, while at the same time um, vilify them for not endorsing your collectivist, sort of supposedly expedient moral conflation of, sort of treating people as a group in order to supposedly uh, transform quicker. There's always a kind of utilitarian argument as to why their form of collective blame will sort of arrive us at the transformation faster, even though that's never happened in practice. And the reason why it's never happened is because, well, not only are we doing it, but that when we do it, we have to get the ideological scapegoat to admit that it was all their fault, and it's because they're not admitting that it's their fault, and they're not, and so it becomes a bait and switch, because you stop getting transformation, and instead you get these promises of a kind of social psychology, of a kind of that they were trying to fix the collective psyche of black pride. It all becomes about sort of focusing on tokenism and on this very disgusting kind of racialist consciousness becomes the whole program. And so you end up not with growth, but you end up with the growth of racial consciousness. That's all it does. And and these greater feelings of resentment and vengeance and retribution, and which just promote more and more of a kind of zero sum way that you end up with, just a very I mean, you end up in a moral and political domain in which you're not capable of political leadership. Becomes a reflection of how well you can peddle the narrative of the identity, and not about manifesto promises and policy choices. It's completely antithetical to democratic literacy. Or perhaps I should say liberal democratic literacy. Anyway, I mean, this is also why, when people talk about the history of this country, it's the reason why I always feel slightly revulsed when people do that is because it's such an egregious diversion from the problems that we have today, which so like you could say that a butterfly flapped its wings 10,000 years ago. We don't talk about that every day. So why are we talking about things that are literally disconnected from today? Or I guess there's a weird kind of metaphorical correlation, I guess, is that, well, if someone was mean to someone in the past and someone is being mean to someone in the present, then because of that kind of similarity, you can say that this reminds us of that, and therefore, because there's a kind of, on some strange abstraction, there's a moral equivalence in some thematic sense, that it's worth repeating, or it's worth remembering, or it's worth keeping in mind. Like, why is it worth keeping in mind? and you get this really strange thing, like what I was saying before about that it becomes this kind of social psychology project, but that in some sense, it's people trying to use politics in lieu of therapy, but in some sense, it's even worse than that because it's not even that they needed therapy, but they certainly need it after involving themselves in such a rampant racialist consciousness and sort of worldview that needs a scapegoat, that needs to be able to divert blame onto an external locus of control so that they can try to build up the image of a racial identity, to try to build up the pride of a racial identity. And this fundamental, therefore, belief that there must be a kind of zero-sum value between racial identity, and it's all about bringing some kind of equilibrium to the identity matrix. Anyway, these are things that I've covered in other recordings, but now it's interesting because I've just talked about identity politics for a long time, but I would argue that this is if you want to boil this down into a more generic and general kind of thing, this happens with narratives. This happens with morality in politics in America, even all the time. This is what this is how corruption in American politics is facilitated, is that you create a moral war. You create a moral war against poverty, against drugs. And then you're not measured by how well your policy does on these issues. You're just measured by the fact that you're doing the right moral thing and that you can do the moral grandstanding on fighting that battle. And it doesn't matter how expensive it is or what the actual effects of it are. If you actually get anywhere in doing it, you're politically rewarded for combating it or something like that. It's a kind of vanity. And then no one even thinks about, well, maybe we should actually legalize drugs because then we could actually diminish them in other ways because then there wouldn't be drug pushers anymore. Because if we legalize drugs and we let people mass produce them, then they would be so cheap that we could then just put in other restrictions that say that you can't market them, you can't promote them, but we make them readily available at places to be sold, and then you don't have drug pushers anymore, and you can let culture decide whether to indulge or not to indulge. And so, uh, people won't have the excuse that someone brought it to them and got them addicted. They would have been forewarned or something like that. And yes, if people are going to harm themselves in a society, well, that's what that's what being grown up in a liberal society looks like. And so, we're never able to grow up. We're always under the infantilism of some kind of moral grandstanding, paternalistic, political ideology. And that's where corruption sneaks in, I would say. Sorry, I mean, I didn't make that point exactly clear, but maybe that point is a bit tenuous. I'd have to thematically work out how to describe it. But, it's what I'm trying to also get at is similar to the theme, in which when you looked at the old politics of the 19th century, even, the debates, they would debate for 6 hours, even, between the political candidates. It was very philosophical often as well. It was very ideological. All of that is gone and replaced with a kind of shorthand, because I think that there is almost no understanding on any political issues anymore. It's all been replaced by these sorts of these superficial narratives. Um, it really is kind of sort of brave new world kind of territory. Um, and it's interesting because a lot of people who are these sort of these revolutionary minded people who are really the exact sort of lemmings that have been mass produced by the oligarchs that essentially crow for more centralization um, and more authoritarian political measures of enforcement, for the environment or something, um, or for the for some kind of morality police. Uh, to protect the vulnerable It's interesting. I was also thinking about this being in parallel. I was thinking of an idea that I've often mentioned before, talking about hypergamy being like a cultural problem, that because we don't tackle that, that has kind of caused a very big imbalance in sort of what I would call the proper gender politics, or sexist politics, or sort of the issues between the sexes that were, I think, properly dealt with by non-sexualism or non-sexism of the 90s, and how that has been overshadowed by what I could only call as a I think identity politics could be regarded as a kind of feminine hypergamous default mode. And it's very interesting because I think that there is obviously, in my view or in my reading of the kind of evolutionary anthropology around, sort of, you can understand that there are going to be a lot of incentives for women or girls to learn about social status and learn about high value and learn about essentially the hierarchy of value that exists within a culture, and then use that as a way to work out their opportunity cost, to work out which casinos they should try to gamble at in terms of uh, marrying up, in terms of having the hypergamous ideal. And the thing is that women don't have to understand the hierarchy of values to do that function. They just have to be able to read the uh, some summary of it. They need to know what it looks like. They need to know what the token of of high social value. They need to know uh, the symbology of it or something like that. They need to be able to perceive it. They don't have to understand it. And this, I think, is also related to the idea of falling into narrative, falling into an external locus of control that then you can always just say, well, the narrative told me that this is how I should understand the world. I don't have my own understanding. I just look at the narrative. And so I think that there is this female tendency to stereotype it that comes in some sense from hypergamy, where it's women don't have to understand a hierarchy of value. They just have to be able to see it in tokens, in symbology. And so if that tendency becomes a kind of matriarch, or becomes, let's say, a cultural hegemon, if that becomes the standard that culture orientates itself around, then you end up with a hollow narrative, because you say that no, 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 we need the narrative to be true so that we can all know what we're doing. But then no one understands the narrative, and the narrative has no values within it that actually cohere, that actually conserve their own internal network and interconnection and integration uh, within some kind of self consistency. So all things like consistency just get thrown out the window. And I mean, it's interesting because you can historically say that feminism produced identity politics, third wave feminism or whatever produced identity politics, or intersectional feminism and all the racial stuff and all that kind of things. But and how it does kind of operate as this general thing that they just want to have an orthodox narrative, that everyone can have a dispensed role to play in bringing about an equilibrium between the identities. So it's almost a way of sort of scripting the solution from a narrative perspective. I can't. I, I spoke to Wolf about this he would tell me, he would use a term. I can't remember the term that he used. It was something like compassion, morality, or mommy morality. I can't, like, caregiving, caregiver ethics, or something like that, which is, and I think Good Mother was also talking to me about it, and she was also referring to Richard Grannon, who was talking about it, about like that kind of moral system isn't very clever, or it just is very unintelligent. It's very simplistic. Um, it ends up not being very ethical, essentially, because it's just kind of very responsive to like treating everything either that it's a vicious predator, or it's like an infant in need of protection. That there's no nuance in between those two categories. I mean, it is interesting how, a lot of these tropes, or a lot of these elements, have often been associated with estrogen. Anyway, I want to talk about brain chemistry stuff. Anyway, so in short, the problem with the American system is that it's prone to this kind of cultural corruption, because it doesn't have, at a principled core, it doesn't have a proper integrity. It has a de facto sort of compromise into the democracy, into the flow of a process or something like that. But it doesn't structure its values in such a way that they actually can be clearly sustained, or because the integrity of the system is already handed over to the democracy. And so judges just don't have the ammunition. They don't have the they've never lived in a legal structure that has the substantive depth to say no to a legislature. Now, in some sense, they can say no to the legislature based on some legislation and constitutional rights that are already um, in the works, that already operate, that are currently operational. Obviously, those things are all liable to change. Every amendment in the American Constitution can just be sectioned out, but it's just, as a structure, it's not robust enough, and in some sense, it really has to do with the problem that it isn't fundamentally permanent. You see, like, they kind of get away with it because it's almost permanent enough in practice, that it's permanent enough, that it's important enough, but it doesn't render itself, it doesn't translate properly into a proper, viable, substantive structure that can actually support and protect the individual, where the individual can claim their proper integrity via and against the state. Um, the democracy gets in the way. And again, that is a clever and, in some sense, a truthful way of stating the truth of it, is that the democracy can get in the way. But can doesn't mean that it may get in the way. You see, like, this is, in my view, the whole ideological corruption of America, which I must say, I tried to say this with as much tenderness as possible, because America was a vital experiment needed. And, my country's constitution would not exist without the experience offered to it by the American Constitution, an American political experiment, as it were. But its corruption, the American corruption, is that it respects the fact that the democracy can destroy the republic, and the whole structure knows that. It realizes that it's one of its fundamental premises. But because it has that fundamental premise woven into it, although it has a very truthful de facto political manifestation, um, it lacks the ability to stand up for the values and the integrity of that is needed to actually have a proper republic and a proper liberty. So those things just they fall to the wayside. Whereas, for example, in the American structure and system, in the South African structure and system, we, in some sense, we don't even regard that the democracy may destroy these things. In some sense, in some sense, we've built in every, or no, there is a sense that they might try, but that they should be thwarted by the structure that is put in place. So in some sense, the whole thing is set up to guard against that the democracy may try to infringe on an individual's constitutional rights. That's what the whole South African system does. And it very clearly says that it cannot do it because uh, and because of the provisions in the Constitution. It says that this is how it cannot do it. Essentially, that's what the South African Constitution is doing. It's saying this is how certain things cannot happen. Even as they may try to do them. So, in some sense, the South African Constitution is really on the front line. It's actually doing the work of having an open, liberal, democratic society, which requires having a supreme constitution, which in some sense America does not have. Or in some sense, if it does have a supreme constitution, it means that its republic is essentially a transient, sort of phantom that can be reframed and decontextualized. And although that is de facto the truth, yes, even if you did have a fully fledged, sort of high integrity structure that was ironclad like the South African one, the South African one has been destroyed. It has been decontextualized and reframed and sort of malevolently interpreted. To mean its opposite, but it has been institutionally corrupted in that sense. But at least I would say that those institutional corruptions stand out. They're not beyond, in some sense, this would, in the American case, I would argue this would be the case that triggers the affordance of the right to claim to sue for revolution, essentially, um, to have a coup against a government to try to uh, reform the judiciary and get rid of the judges that were politically appointed, essentially to diminish and ideologically corrupt and institutionally corrupt the morality of the law itself. I think all those things are somewhat permissible. I also think that we could also have a war crimes Hague International War Crimes Tribunal. Although this doesn't, I mean, I would argue, okay, like war crimes, international law provides for war crimes, but I think that, or very clearly, obviously, war crimes maybe haven't happened yet. Although I would argue there has already been propaganda for genocide. Um, so maybe very few war crimes, and maybe that's a controversial claim to make, but I would argue that the damage that has been done to the South African Constitution is fundamentally a crime against humanity. I would argue that. I mean, this document, which was the whole point of the 1994 Democratic Revolution, has been so thoroughly abused and dissolved, and it's still there on paper, but it's been murdered, it's been betrayed, and the people who have betrayed it, they have names, they have addresses, they can be sentenced. I mean, I wouldn't be against having a Truth and Reconciliation Commission 2.0 for these people, but they need to. I mean, I don't. I think in some sense the ANC needs to not be able to call itself the ANC anymore, because it's no longer the ANC. I would say ever since Thabo Mbeki was removed, it's never been the same institution or organization. But anyway, but even under him, it was giving way to some of this racialist stuff. Kind of started. Uh, some of the policy started then, but then it just was such a corrupting. It was just such a fundamentally kind of corrupt ability for people to use to access resources, because you're literally saying that people get granted something just based on a superficial feature. Therefore, you can use it to give it to a politically connected person. There's no merit in any of the structure. It's completely artificial. It's just an artificial attribution of some kind of where the actual people who are disadvantaged never are beneficiaries. It's only essentially people who are already rich, who are already politically connected and well to do. Anyway, sorry, I guess I'm probably talking about too many different things.